Thank you for the great discussion, Jalen, Paul, Suzanne, and Jonathan. I'd now like to invite our second panel to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Jerusalem Demsas as our moderator. Jerusalem is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and host of the Good on Paper podcast. And joining her, we have Tim Bartik, a senior economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, Adam Dean, an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, Chirag Mehta, policy center, associate professor of government at Cornell University, and inaugural director of the Cornell Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures.
Okay, hello everyone. We don't have a clock up here, so I'm going to be periodically checking. Oh, I don't have a watch either, so we're just going to go on a vibe. Fantastic. Okay. So, moderator's prerogative, something each one of the three academics over here have, three of our academics, not sitting together, have proposed ideas for how to respond to right-wing populism. And Chirag has directly in organizing spaces, which are places where we can learn a lot qualitatively about this work as well. So what I want to do is kind of go one by one through the three proposed solutions and have kind of everyone on the panel talk about them, so we can get a little interdisciplinary rather than siloed. Tim, I'm going to start with you. So your focus is on place-based policies and how those sorts of investments can push back on the types of distressed communities, the problems these distressed communities have faced, many of whom are identified in the previous panel as sources for rising right-wing populism. Can you describe how place-based investments push against right-wing populism?
Okay, technology is working now. I guess the main point I want to make, pushing back against the pessimism, is that place-based policies can work to take a local economy facing significant competitive challenges and turning it around. I don't think, however, there's one solution. I mean, one of the key things I want to say is one size does not fit all. What works for one local economy will not work for another. The only common elements, it seems to me, are one, local leadership that is willing to come up with a strategy to reinvent the local economy. If you're facing competitive challenges, just doing the same old thing is a recipe for death. You got to adapt to a changing economy. And so you need the local leadership that can recognize that, come up with a sensible strategy, and then you need to somehow mobilize the resources to implement that strategy in the absence of really any significant state and federal support for this, state and federal government support. So in my work, I've given lots of examples. You know, in the interest of time, I'll just briefly mention four today. Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Crosby-Ironton area of Minnesota, which is on the edge of the Iron Range. So what have these areas done? Lehigh Valley faced the collapse of the steel industry in the early 1980s. What did they do? They particularly tried to encourage high-tech spin-offs from Lehigh University, and they also did some stuff with warehousing. They did some selective stuff with manufacturing, but on the whole, they emphasized high-tech and warehousing a lot more. They had a research university, Lehigh University. Grand Rapids, Michigan, not the strategy. Grand Rapids, Michigan does not have a research university. What it has is a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers. Some of which are in office furniture, some of which are in auto supply. They helped a lot of them diversify into healthcare. They helped upgrade the job training in a lot of these areas. They didn't have a research university, they bought one. A bunch of rich poobahs at Grand Rapids, I shouldn't say bribe, they induced Michigan State University to relocate much of its medical school to Grand Rapids. Okay, so that's what they did in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids has had manufacturing job growth over the last 30 years. It has twice the U.S. average in manufacturing employment as a share of the economy. Tulsa, Oklahoma, oil and gas area. Obviously, they recognize oil and gas is not the future. They've emphasized remote worker attraction. They've emphasized trying to build up high tech, particularly in software. They, again, do not have a research university. They've gotten the local private college to emphasize software development. They also do some stuff in drone manufacturing, building on some strengths in aviation. Crosby Ironton, Minnesota. They have a bunch of abandoned open pit iron mines. What did they do? Well, they became picturesque lakes. They built in a premier mountain biking course around the lakes. This builds up tourism. It attracts remote workers. It attracts people with second homes. Does this mean that every rural area in the U.S. should develop mountain biking? No, it does not mean that. It means you need to have a strategy based on your location, based on your particular strengths, and see what works. And one of the key things here is you need the resources to do it. It's sometimes forgotten that things like TVA, which the federal government did in the past, at its peak spent $300 per capita for around 10 years. $300 per capita for about 10 years. That's about what it takes to turn around a local economy.
Tim, I want to interrupt you because I'm a journalist and that's what we do. And I want to push you here because I think that we want to distinguish between two things on this panel. One is certain policy outcomes that we think are great. We might care about manufacturing growth increasing. We might care about, other forms of, tourists increasing or increasing remote workers living somewhere. But focusing on right-wing populism, 3 of the 4 places you mentioned, I don't know Crosby, Minnesota, but Lehigh, Pennsylvania, Grand Rapids, Michigan, these are not places that show like a real repudiation of right-wing populism. So are there examples of place-based investments actually leading to the change we're looking for now?
I'm not a political scientist. I'm going to focus on solving the economic problems of these areas, not necessarily solving some political problem. That's what my interest is, solving these economic problems. Does that contribute to solving right-wing populism? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I mean, it's a matter of economic justice for me regardless of what it does. I mean, there are some peculiar politics here. A lot of the stuff in both Tulsa and in Grand Rapids are financed by, we talked about plutocrats earlier, they're financed by very rich people. I mean, in the case of Grand Rapids, the DeVosses and the Van Andels, very conservative Republicans, they're running an industrial policy in Grand Rapids. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. And, in Tulsa, it's George Kaiser Family Foundation, a very rich oil and gas guy who I think is pretty liberal politically, but, the politics are curious. I mean, my view is we need to try to solve the economic problems of distressed places because it's the right thing to do. Whether or not that will solve right-wing populism, I have no idea.
So, Chirag, I want to bring you in here because I think that something you've talked about is equitable implementation of federal investments. And, Tim's proposal tries to target things towards areas with specific types of economic disenfranchisement. And I wonder, when you were thinking about the IRA and other federal investments that have happened in the past, a lot of industrial policy happened under the Biden administration. In your view, is there some lesson to take for that about how to equitably distribute these kind of federal resources, and how would you want to see place-based policy done in the future?
Yeah, I think a good example, and by the way, just really appreciate the invitation to participate in the conversation. Just obviously, we're at a really important inflection point in this country, and so this conversation is just one of many that has to happen. I want to talk actually about childcare and the federal investment in childcare. So we're actually coming off a day yesterday where we experienced the biggest work stoppage in the childcare sector ever in this country. 1,400 providers. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but 4 years ago when we started organizing childcare providers, about 100 closed their doors. Yesterday, 1,400 providers closed their doors, allied themselves with the families that they serve, the kids that they serve, to demonstrate and demand a fair, equitable, and just childcare system. That is amazing in and of itself. It's a huge risk for providers to take, to close their doors. But we built this power over time. We have a long way to go, but we built this power in sort of 2 different ways. One is really emphasizing this sort of culture of belonging, that really everybody, especially groups that are othered otherwise, by right-wing populists, that we all belong in this childcare system. No matter whether you're black and brown. I mean, Black and brown women are really the backbone of the childcare system. So no matter who you are, what your identity is, you belong. You teach in a public school, you teach in a preschool center, you take care of kids or teach in your home. You all belong in this system. And we also have built a sort of culture of solidarity through this work, where we believe, it's a value of ours, that there's no way we're going to win the kind of childcare system that we all deserve unless we all actually have each other's backs. No one group, whether you're preschool teachers, whether you're in the public schools, or whether you're teaching in your home, no one group can win this system on their own, that we actually do need all of us. And so, the federal government does spend some money on childcare. When we started this work 10 years ago, we really started by trying to organize, both parents and providers to shape just how this program was implemented on the ground. The Child Care Development Block Grant is the program. It varies state by state how it's implemented. It's, in some places the government actively tries to keep families from actually accessing the program. In other places they try harder to make it work. But the point is that families and providers absolutely cared about how this program worked. And so they wanted to engage at a very deep level on implementation. And by way of that process, they also learned why it doesn't work. And the sort of political powers that were the forces that were in play that kept the system from working. And so not only were they fighting to make sure the program as it existed worked for people, but by way of this process, they began to organize other people to participate in a political process to demand an entirely different childcare system, one that was really rooted in our values. And to me, so where we see, around the country, the movement that has propped up, this is sort of one, I guess to us, it's sort of one lens into how we beat back right-wing populism. We can actually organize around public benefits in ways that build a culture of solidarity and belonging. We fight for I call it a contract. So policy to me is a contract. I think in the labor movement world, the contract is with the employer. To me, policy is a contract with government. And so we fight for a contract that leaves no one behind. It's a contract that makes sure that everyone actually does belong, in the contract. So we fight for that contract to make sure everybody belongs. And that's how we actually can, that's one way of how we beat back right-wing populism. I think healthcare, Dr. Michener can probably say a lot more on the opportunity in healthcare, but there's tens of millions of people who are completely fed up with our healthcare system. And they understand that, healthcare owners, capitalists in the healthcare system see their illness as a source of profit extraction. And I think there's an opportunity to build real multiracial solidarity around a vision for an entirely different healthcare system, and perhaps Medicaid beneficiaries might be a tip of the spear in organizing that kind of healthcare movement.
So Jamila has gotten 3 bat signals in what you just said, not just her name, not just the word Medicaid, but even the idea of distributing benefits through the states. So I was it's like we planned this moment for me, so thank you, Chirag. But I was thinking about this in regards to Tim's proposal on place-based policy, because Jamila's written one of my favorite public policy books of all time, which I'm sure she's annoyed about talking about now. Everyone always asks you to come talk about fragmented democracy. But in your book, you talk about how Medicaid delivery at the state level, the local level, really differentiates itself from place to place based on like whether people want to actually give Medicaid services well, or they want to treat people with dignity. And this is like a problem with all federal programs, if they're given all federal programs that are given through block grants to states or ones that are given to localities. I mean, we saw this with the rent relief that came during the Biden administration. The distribution of that was wildly different across different localities. The attempt to get it from tenants was wildly different, and people experienced it very, very differently depending on where they lived. I wonder if, when we're thinking about place-based policies, then ones that would be implemented at the local level, where that research kind of comes in to inform how that should be done, or should we just be skeptical about whether that kind of policy is a good way of distributing resources and benefits?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So many bat signals, and I love them all, and I appreciate the skepticism. And I think there's maybe some gaps to bridge between the conversation that's been bubbling up here and the conversation that the panels prior to us have had, right? So a couple of times, this idea of deliverism, or this idea of policy that sort of really engages, connects, and addresses the challenges that people are facing in their everyday life, right? Whether it's around accessing healthcare and being able to live healthy lives, or whether it's around economic justice and being able to have access to necessary economic resources, we think about policy as the vehicle for providing that, right? But it turns out it's much more complicated than that. And even in an ideal world where there's an administration that is passing policies that are attempting to do that, right? You mentioned rent relief under the Biden administration. We might think about Medicaid via Medicaid expansion or what have you. There can still be disconnects, right? Because of the way the policies are implemented and of the differential ways they're implemented in different places, right? Particularly in a federated polity like the one we have now, and even given sort of local heterogeneity and differences in how things are happening at the local level. So that's challenging. It creates a disconnect between what is being delivered and what is being experienced, right? And that's under the best circumstances, when there are actually things being delivered, right? We're in a different phase now, but even under the best circumstance, that disconnect is a problem. And at the same time, all morning or all afternoon, I don't even know what time of day it is, as we've been talking about right-wing populism, part of what we've been reflecting on is that at the heart of it is a disconnect, right? A feeling that the government is not actually doing what I need. It's not giving me what I need, whether it's folks in rural areas, whether it's low-income people who are suffering, whether it's anyone facing economic insecurity. I'm not getting what I need from the government. Why should I care about it? Why should I invest in it? And that kind of thinking is driving the core political problem here, right? And this is where I want to sort of intervene around what Tim said, where Tim said, well, I'm thinking about economic justice, not the political pieces. And I think the logic of what us political scientists call policy feedback is that those things are deeply connected, right? That the choices that we're making around economic, and in fact, I would say part of the logic of this whole essay series, but the choices that we're making around economic policies, or even around policies we might not think of as economic, healthcare policy you may or may not think of as economic policy, housing policy you may or may not think of it that way, but it is affecting people's economic and material well-being in really profound ways. And the choices that we make about that are not just around economic realities, but they feed into political realities. And they're feeding into those political realities in ways that are perverse, right? And in ways that are creating the doom loops that Paul talked about and that John talked about, and that are deepening those doom loops, right? And I appreciate the intervention from Tim around, well, maybe there's something local, there's something concrete, there's something about what's happening in particular places, in particular people's lives, that is a way to address that. And I actually agree with that inclination, but I also think the local can be a double-edged sword, right? It can be a vehicle for deepening the disconnects between people and policy, right? And I think the suggestion is, how do we use place-based policies to bridge those disconnects, to provide another pathway, right? But the reality, and I think where your skepticism is coming from, is that place-based policies can do both, right? Or federal policies that ended up getting implemented on a place-based level in differential ways. So there are ways those policies can deepen the disconnects and further drive right-wing populism. And there are ways that those policies can bridge the disconnects and be an antidote or diffuse right-wing populism and other perverse political patterns that are at the heart of the kind of democratic rot that we've all been grappling with today. So I want to wrap up, but I'll say this, Chirag is sitting next to me and I'm super excited. We've been working on some things together, but what I will say is what I believe is a key difference between whether place-based policies or any policies, in fact, deepen our political woes or address them has to do with the process by which those policies actually get advanced. And so when people are engaged in that process in a deep and substantial way, then the policies not only will be more attentive to the realities of their lives and therefore have a chance to produce political good as well, but also the processes by which those policies get advanced are reinforcing political goods as well. And again, the economic and the political are deeply intertwined. We don't get to policies that truly meet people's economic needs through non-democratic means, right? Like, look, if there are wealthy people somewhere in Michigan that have a whole bunch of money and want to do something, okay, but that is not on a large scale going to resolve the problem, because the process to getting to these place-based policies that are going to be most effective needs to involve people, lots of people, ordinary people who are organized, right? Not just showing up now and then, voting, but not just voting. People who are organized and exercising and deploying power in ways that alter the possibilities of what those economic policies look like. And without that, I think we get the skeptical outcome that you're concerned about out of place-based policies, even if occasionally we get some that are good or that are promising or that do good things. Ultimately, that doesn't give us an antidote to the democratic problems that we're experiencing unless it's done in a way that is itself democratic.
Can I add something to this? I guess I would say that the way I would look at it is the problem with relying on benevolent local billionaires is, one, a lot of places don't have benevolent local billionaires. Two, benevolent local billionaires can sometimes favor really stupid local policies that make no sense. But the reality is there is not significant federal or state government support in most states for long-term investment in place-based revitalization. There simply isn't. We've retreated from this. We don't have things like TVA. We don't have things like the Appalachian Regional Commission. We don't have things, well, of course, urban renewal had a lot of failures, a lot of problems, how it was designed. But we retreated away from this. And we look at the state level, what on earth is California doing for the Central Valley, Fresno, Bakersfield? Squat. So in general, we have a problem, and the reliance on benevolent billionaires is due to the absence of state and federal action to deal with the problem of place distress.
Can I just quickly say, totally agree, totally agree. But what I want to say is that absence is not something to be taken as a given or as an inevitability. Instead, that absence can be rectified through power deployed from grassroots or from within grassroots communities. And I know this is not how all of us think. We're like, no, power, that's top down. But like that doesn't have to be true. And as hackneyed as the quote might be, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, it never will, right? Those federal resources need to be demanded. And the power that it will take, which will have to be significant to successfully demand them, has to be built from the ground up, because we don't have benevolent political elites who are deciding that they want to give to the masses either. So we don't have benevolent billionaires. We don't have benevolent political beliefs. Benevolence is not going to get us there. Power will.
Adam, I want to bring you in here, and as you can tell, the theme of my moderating is creating conflict. So, no, I'm just creating it anyway. Your proposal is around the proliferation of bad jobs in the United States and the need to create better ones, which you define in various ways, including on wages and concrete benefits, as well as other less material things. Good jobs are concentrated and agglomerated in areas of the country. They are not spread equally. There's a lot of geographic inequality in where good jobs are. Tim is very skeptical of the idea that we should push people and move people towards good jobs. Areas of the country, for instance, where you see much higher relative wages, where you see greater access to a bunch of different kinds of resources, where there are different kinds of amenities people might value. And this is something that other people have written about, including my former editor, Yoni Applebaum's new book, Stuck, which is fantastic. It talks about the history of mobility in the United States. And I wonder, it feels much easier to move people to good jobs, and I know why Tim is skeptical about this, and we'll let him answer this and tell me why I'm wrong. But do you feel, from your perspective, as someone who's concerned about getting people to those good jobs, that is creating them in distressed communities is a better path than getting people to the places where they can actually access that employment opportunity? And that doesn't mean moving from rural Wisconsin to New York City. It can literally just mean being able to access the major urban job center in your area.
Yeah. So is this working there or not? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation. I want to give a shout out to Jamila McCallum, who wrote the essay with me. But I think to understand the importance of good jobs, to understand the current predicament we're in terms of the crisis of democracy, crisis of income inequality, you really need to take a historical and comparative perspective on the problem. And for me, that goes back to the original struggle for democracy in each country. And I think that the nature of that original struggle, the original sins of some of those struggles, are what we're living through today. So specifically what I have in mind is looking at the role that labor unions have played in that original struggle for democracy and seeing the sort of path-dependent outcome ever since. So if you go back the last 50 years and think about where unions were an important part of the struggle for democracy versus where they weren't, we see radically different outcomes. Where unions helped lead the struggle for democracy, right after the transition to democracy, they were legitimized and rewarded with new labor legislation, new constitutions that protected workers' rights, and that set a strong foundation for strong unions, which then create the kind of good jobs that we're talking about. Following the implementation of those labor rights, you see a decrease in income inequality over time, you see an increase in the quality of democracy, and you see a decrease in the probability of reverting to autocracy. That's all what happens where unions have helped lead the struggle for democracy. They put us on a path to some kind of sustainable social democracy. In the majority of democratic transitions of the last 50 years, that wasn't the case. Unions, for various reasons, were not at the vanguard of leading the struggle for democracy. Following those democratic transitions, including the American Revolution, the development of democracy in the United States, you don't get an increase in labor rights, and you're set on a long-term trajectory of bad jobs. There can be ups and downs over time, but I think what we're currently living through is the structural problems that were created at the original moment of the creation of democracy around the world, and the sort of different process that we're speaking about there. The bad news in the United States is that our original struggle for democracy was not led by labor unions. The potentially good news and optimistic look on this is that today we are facing another struggle for democracy in the United States. And we've seen labor unions recognize that problem, recognize and stepping up to organize protests and small mobilizations at this point in favor of what we could only call democracy. And I think that if unions do that, I don't know about these smaller policy implementation questions that other people are talking about. In terms of the big macro perspective here, if unions in the United States step up, help to lead the struggle for democracy in the United States today, I think they will be rewarded in a sort of once-in-a-century opportunity with something like a new Wagner Act, which would put us on a better trajectory moving forward of labor rights, better jobs, higher quality democracy, and avoiding the sort of reversion to autocracy we're struggling with today. So for me, I think it's this broader historical perspective about where good jobs have come from, and it's really sort of taking advantage of those rare moments that we find ourselves in today.
Adam, you're being too nice, so I'm going to ask you again. Agglomeration, though. Good jobs are agglomerated in big cities and smaller cities, and you know, they're not equally distributed. And with even the idea of unions, it's much easier to organize in places where there's a greater density of workers. We see this repeatedly. It's much harder to organize in rural America. So you see greater returns to scale even in places where you can see an agglomeration of workers. So don't you feel like there may be a trade-off between your vision of trying to create a unionized, dense workforce and putting extra money into place-based policies?
A lot of the work that Jamie and I have done is about the benefits of unions, not only for workers in the workplace that they're representing in terms of lower injury rates, safety, and but also the broader benefits of the community. So we did a lot of work during the pandemic about nursing homes and COVID, and we showed that unionized nursing homes had lower rates of infections not only for workers, but death rates for residents, really trying to highlight these broader benefits. But again, I do think, picking up on what Sarah Nelson was saying earlier, I think that if you think about what the problem is for the American labor movement today, it's that there's broad support for unions, and the majority of workers when surveyed say they'd like to join a union, and yet we see union density down below 10%. And the reason for that is labor law and the lack of protection for labor rights in the United States. And I come back to this macro perspective. If we really want to see a resurgent labor movement, we need a change in labor law. And the reality, unfortunately, over the last 50 years is that a big increase in labor law, like the original Wagner Act, is much more likely during these transformations, during these fluid moments following the struggle for democracy. We didn't get that last time. Other countries have the benefit of that sort of foundation of labor rights following a sort of union-backed struggle for democracy. And I think my biggest hope for the American labor movement, but also for our society more broadly, is that we see unions step up and get rewarded for leading the struggle now for democracy in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to let Tim close himself out, and then we'll move Jamila into the hot seat.
Well, I guess I want to add something about this good jobs thing. I think there are a number of avenues to good jobs. Unions are one. Higher minimum wage is another. I see Michael Rice. I talked to him. Higher minimum wage, he can tell you all about that. Higher social wage through Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance, et cetera. Stronger Social Security, that's all good. but also pushing up the employment rate. The prime age employment rate allows for occupational upgrading, puts upward pressure on local real wages. That contributes to good jobs as well. Now, why not just move people to where the good jobs are, what was said earlier? Because it doesn't help those left behind. In fact, it probably hurts them. When we, if out-migration could solve the problems of distressed places, Flint should be booming, because it's had out-migration for years. But what happens? When people move out of a distressed place, the percentage decline in population is matched by a percentage decline in jobs. The employment rate is no better. Actually, it's probably in some cases worse off. Moving people out destroys jobs. So the notion that we can, I'm all in favor of, helping, loosening up housing supply in Silicon Valley. Maybe a few people will move from Crosby, Ironton, Minnesota to Silicon Valley. Maybe a few people move from Flint to there. They'll be better off, maybe, right? So that would be good. But is that going to solve the problem of those left behind? No, it's not. You have to, at some point, address the fact that people have attachments to places. They value that. And if you don't recognize that, then I think you really can't do policies that are adapted to people's needs. We talked about dignity earlier, people's demands for dignity, the fact they value the place they're from. Most Americans are not as hypermobile as the average Harvard professor. Most Americans, like 60% of Americans live within 30 miles of where they were born. That's the reality of America. We need to deal with it.
Sure.
Well, I just want to this point, I mean, for most people, policy is something that is done to them. They have no control or power over policy and what it's doing to them. And that is actually part of, at least to us, I mean, that's part of the political problem that we have to solve for. We're not going to build a movement strong enough to beat back right-wing populism unless we really invest in the agency and dignity as put in the framing paper, like infusing policy with delivering power to people, recognizing their agency, recognizing their dignity. We are not going to build a movement strong enough to beat back right-wing populism. And so we take seriously, really on any policy, whether it's care policy, whether it's jobs policy, we always think about how do you engage people in the actual implementation of the policy we're talking about. We take people seriously at that level. They want to be taken seriously at that level. And we don't really stop at just sort of implementing the policy and making sure that the policy gets implemented well. That's an on-ramp. That's an on-ramp to organizing a much broader movement for political transformation, for real transformational change, like going back to the child care example. The child care law in this country is completely inadequate. People come to that conclusion. They come to that conclusion one way or another. But we want them to come to that conclusion alongside others who are invested in this political project of building a movement for transformational change. Because otherwise, they come to a conclusion that nothing they do matters.
I think there's actually a lot of overlap between what you just said and Jamila's proposal, which is around tenant organizing and bringing folks together through tenant organizing in order to combat the rise of right-wing populism. And Jamila, I want you to explain the mechanisms by which that happens. Like, how does tenant organizing actually lead to that pushback? And also, my skeptical rejoinder to you is we live in such a country of residential segregation. And the goal of organizing is to make salient differences that are politically helpful, not ones that are politically harmful. And doesn't tenant organizing exacerbate a lot of these problems? Like, if you're living in a building that's just your racial group and your class group and your employment group, and then you're not really getting the kind of benefits of broad-based labor organizing we see in other countries where you do bring people together in a cross-class, cross-racial coalition.
Yeah, I feel like I really enjoy your skepticism. Even when we've had conversations separate from this, it's one of my favorite things. So thank you for that. I want to say, actually, the first part of your prompt, which is what are the mechanisms through which tenant organizing might have anything to do with diffusing right-wing populism? And the second part of your prompt, which is like, but isn't this something that exacerbates potentially differences given the structural realities of racial segregation? Residentially, are actually deeply connected, right? The second part in some ways is the answer to the first part, right? So one of the things that I found while studying tenant organizing for the last 4 or 5 years is actually that the most inspiring and best organizing that happens operates in a way that actually diffuses and bridges these differences, right? So you don't go into a segregated community and organize people on the basis of that segregation in a way that's going to deepen those divides, and which would frankly further the problems that we're talking about politically, right? Instead, you think about how to organize in ways that bridge those gaps, right? And in the piece, I talk about an example from the Louisville Tenant Union that's done an amazing job of both organizing low-income Black women in public housing projects and organizing low-income white folks in trailer homes, right? But not organizing them separately, not going to one set over here and another set over here and saying like, well, we're gonna do with you what works for you, and we're gonna do with you what works for you. But instead, bringing those folks into the same space and saying, actually, what looks like very different and in some ways potentially what could be framed as competitive prerogatives, like you think that you're struggling in this trailer home because the Louisville city government is investing too much into these Black people in public housing. Actually, that's not the nature of the problem. And once you understand, we develop a shared understanding of the nature of the problem, we can see that it's the same problem, or not the same problem, but it's the problems are a manifestation of the same underlying challenges, right? In terms of who has power, who has resources, how it's being distributed, who has voice, right? And so you use organizing as a mechanism to bring these very different kinds of people together and to then channel their combined power, which we need, right? And so, and how do you do that? There's, Chirag could probably tell you the mechanisms like on a really, in a really nuts and bolts way better than I can. But part of it is by providing those folks with a shared narrative, helping them to co-develop a shared narrative, allowing them to see each other and one another's problems as connected to deeper structural problems, and then giving them ways of exercising their power together and getting material wins, even if you start with small material wins and then you build towards more. But part of the reason why I'll end with this, people are like, how are you doing this tenant organizing stuff for me? But you're the Medicaid person. I am the Medicaid person, right? And these things are deeply connected. When I was working on my first book, and as I've continued studying Medicaid since then, you talk to Medicaid beneficiaries and you ask them about what they think could be different in the program. They will tell you really specific, really smart things about how these programs can be improved, right? But there's no channel for what they understand experientially about how to improve systems like that to get anywhere. There's no channel for it to do anything. They don't have power. So we can diagnose the problems with the system, but without a way of them being able to do something, it's not clear that there's a solution to those problems. And one of the things that I got frustrated with studying Medicaid was I felt like my mission as a scholar was to diagnose problems to which there was no real solution, as far as I could tell. And when I stumbled across, in the context of different research, tenant organizing, and I started focusing on that in housing policy, I realized, organizing is actually a pathway to not just diagnosing and chronicling problems, but potentially solving them. And that's not limited to the tenant space, right? That can happen in examples Adam gave and that lots of people have given throughout the day. We've seen it happen historically and contemporarily with labor and unions. It can happen in the healthcare space, right? Organizing is a mechanism of addressing some of the problems that we've been diagnosing today. And it's a mechanism that brings in the people who are closest to the problem and makes them a central part of the solution. And so I think it's just a technique that is going to be critical to really addressing the core issues that we've been engaging today.
So Adam, I want to bring you in here because you are our resident union person. I think there's a lot of, well, I guess we have two on the stage, but we have this question about broad-based union organizing. So a lot of work from folks who do comparative research, and they look at countries where you see a lot higher union density as you see sectoral bargaining. And part of the reason why that is often better from a democratic, multi-democratic perspective is that you're actually able to get the interests of a larger swath of people, and you don't get smaller groups that often, instead of advocating for workers, capital W workers, they only care about their workers, which can happen at the expense of other people. Not always, but it can. I wonder how you think this might apply to tenant organizing, because I think it doesn't have to happen this way, but often tenant organizing, you're organizing one building, you're organizing a block, you're organizing a very small, discrete number of people. And that means you can have situations, as I've reported in tenant organizing spaces, where there are organic desires for things that are net harmful for renters in the aggregate. For instance, if you're asking for, we just want the rent in our building frozen, and that could be helpful for you, but then that means no one else in the city is actually getting any benefits from that. All the political capital has been spent on you. It might raise rents in other ways. It might raise development costs. So do you think about that theory of larger scale unionization efforts being needed applies also to this space?
I don't know anything about tenant organizing, but I will say in terms of like the broader trade-offs you're talking about in like union debates, these are usually debates about what people call labor insiders versus labor outsiders, right? And somehow the benefits, and Sarah Nelson talked about this earlier, saying instead of saying, you have a pension, I should have a pension too, we say, I don't have a pension, so you shouldn't have a pension either. I think in the healthcare union space that Jamie and I have been working on, one of the places we see this as an issue is what happens following unionization, like newly unionized nursing homes, increase labor costs. And it's a for-profit nursing home and healthcare system. And so managers then face an issue of what to do with increased labor costs following unionization. And how do we make sure that they don't do something that endangers patients, especially in the healthcare setting. And so I think what you need to do then, and maybe there's parallels with tenant organizing too, is you need unions to work hand in hand with government regulation. And so there was a federal rule, which has now been overturned by the courts. Maybe many of you have seen about staffing minimums in nursing homes. So when unions newly unionize a nursing home and increase labor costs, management often responds by cutting workers or by shifting towards less skilled, lower paid workers, and that can endanger patient care. Unions, I think, increase voice in the workplace, decrease turnover and increase retention and skill and all these different ways that can offset those potential harms. But what's really needed is a federal policy or state level policy to come in and say that we're not going to allow managers to put profit above patients and to turn what otherwise is a benefit for workers into a harm for residents by basically de-skilling the workers in the nursing home. And so I think there is a need for that. I don't know if you see something similar in tenant organizing, where some of these negative spillover effects should be recognized and can be addressed through proper regulation.
And Chirag, I want to bring you in here because I think this is a space where understanding what's actually happening in organizing conversations is helpful. And you've had, I think, maybe more of that than anyone else on this stage. Often when I'm talking directly to constituents, tenants, et cetera, they are often asking for demands that are not pushing against right-wing populism, but are in favor of right-wing populism. And the way that you're describing organizing is about bottom-up power, not top-down. And it seems like some of the demands that are being made from the bottom up are ones that maybe actually encourage right-wing populism. So how should we think about that from a democratic perspective?
Can you just say one more thing on that? Like, give me.
Yeah. So I mean, for instance, there was a lot of voting for Trump, or a lot of. There was a lot of support for Donald Trump's election among senior union officials. I know that, according to Adam's paper, that there is some pushback from union voters and households themselves. But clearly, a lot of the unions that got a lot of support from the Biden administration, the demands from their workers were not uniformly in favor, or even largely in favor of pushing back against the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think a couple things on this. So, and Jamila, you should provide context to this too, if need be. But I think amongst Medicaid beneficiaries, I think Trump won Medicaid beneficiaries 49-47. It's not always been that way, but that sticks with me. Just because people are getting a public benefit, something as critical, as important as Medicaid, it doesn't mean that they aren't also, swimming in a sea of, othering kind of politics and attacks on people. They can hold, both things can be true at the same time. The only thing that I think that I know that can combat that is organization. It is through organization that you build a different kind of culture, a culture of belonging, as I put it before, and a culture of solidarity. That takes long-term leadership development work, political education that, again, only happens through organization. And so unless we're committed to building organization, I don't think we're necessarily going to see a real change in those kinds of numbers. I mean, I think it goes back to this conversation about, what can happen when there's more place-based investment. Does that translate into different political outcomes? It can, if people are actually being organized and you really engage people at a pretty basic level about and doing a real power analysis of like why the conditions are the way they are, and how to then build really genuine solidarity with people who they would otherwise think are just very different, and some, maybe even to blame for some of the problems they experience. I don't know, there's a lot more to say on this, but it really happens, it does happen in building a very, at a human level, relationship between people in community. Yeah.
This is kind of a, oh, Tim, yeah.
Well, I guess to hop into this area of neighborhoods, I have no quarrel with tenant organizing, healthcare organizing. I think all that's great. I do think people need to think about what are the key leverage points to really affect people's lives, maybe affect their politics, but certainly affect their lives. And the whole reason I went into economics, because I think good jobs is the way to do it. And, I was very influenced by William Julius Wilson's work. And I think this was reinforced by Raj Chetty's recent work. Good jobs in a neighborhood or in a local labor market and getting more people into them has enormous leverage effects on everything about that neighborhood, everything about that local area. It affects the crime rate, it affects the whole atmosphere of the area, it affects school quality, everything else. And, so I think, personally, I think we need to think through at the local labor market level, the neighborhood level, how do we turn around the job situation for that local area? Again, housing is important, healthcare is important, all important, but if you don't turn around the good job situation, I don't think you can really address the problem.
This is a great segue to then turn to Adam's proposal a little bit further. So I think that there is, as you mentioned in your paper, there is a widespread sense that there are a lot of bad jobs in the American economy. And I wanted to go look for survey evidence, and I was really surprised by a Pew poll. I don't know if you saw it. From December of 2024, so at the end of last year, that found that 50% of all employed adults are extremely/very satisfied with their jobs, and only 12% are not too satisfied/not at all satisfied. And then when it digs deeper into this question of like, for the folks who aren't satisfied, what's going on, 82%, almost everyone is talking about their pay. The pay is not keeping up with the cost of living. And interestingly, 82% of people say that they feel respected by their employer, by their coworkers, and roughly 72% of people say they feel respected by their clients and their customers. This, I think, is a very different picture of jobs than I think we're used to hearing. And I wonder what evidence you're seeing that pushes back and says, actually, jobs are really bad, or are you looking at different kinds of metrics here?
I've never seen that poll before. That's fascinating. Maybe they were taking it at work.
Mm-hmm. Right in front of their employer, yeah. It's like those.
No, I don't know. I think that the evidence that I think about when I look at surveys are, again, public support for unions, the percentage of people who say they would like to be in a union if they had the opportunity, and that is at historic highs in the United States. Mm-hmm. So maybe people are happy with their jobs and think they could be slightly better. Mm-hmm. I usually interpret the growing public support for unions as evidence that people are unhappy with their jobs. But thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, well, the reason I also bring this up too is because I think that on this panel we have like very innovative ideas for trying to push back on right-wing populism. But when you talk to people, the number one thing, especially in this last election we heard, was about inflation, right? And I wonder if there's actually, I mean, the Biden administration focused a lot on trying to create good jobs when they were doing their industrial policy. Some people said maybe too much work was spent on that versus just trying to address inflation. So when you hear that, are you concerned about, do you think that that's something to maybe be more skeptical about trying to create good jobs versus we just need to bring down prices? That's the only thing people really care about.
I think I find the sort of like post-Biden administration soul-searching conclusion that the problems with the IRA, where it's slow implementation in terms of building things that take 4, 5, 6 years that won't be done before the next election. I've taken those to heart, and I think the need to do smaller things more quickly is a sort of growing consensus that I've been hearing here in DC, and I think some of that is still around a sort of Green New Deal perspective, where you push at the state level for solar panels on schools. I've got a friend who's been working on that at the local level, looking at state level green banks, advocating for those kinds of policies that are then built by unionized labor. And so you create the sort of same kinds of Green New Deal type coalitions, but at the local level rather than from the top down at the federal level. And then I think just in general, pushing for things that benefit workers and increase workplace safety at the state level to sort of demonstrate the ability of government to deliver, but at the local level, I think it's still a way forward, especially with gridlock and the sort of inability to do things at the federal level now.
And kind of going off of what you were saying earlier about unionization in the United States and the legal fixes that need to happen, what actually would need to happen to get us the union density of a place like Sweden or other countries that see high numbers of folks in those kinds of jobs?
Pass the PRO Act, as Jamie and I like to end all of our essays by saying that is dead in the water now. But yeah, I mean, you need to stop employers from violating the labor laws that are on the books with impunity. Right? You have employers who think to themselves, it's cheaper to union bust now. We probably won't get caught, even if we do. Very small fine, sometimes years later, rather than dealing with a union. So I think changing labor law is the only way forward.
Great. Well, that is all of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists because they withstood my my journalistic inquiries. But give them a round of applause.
All right, thank you for a terrific discussion, Jerusalem, Tim, Jamila, Chirag, and Adam. We are running a few minutes late, so bear with us as we have Sameera Fazili, Equitable Growth's board member, join us to provide some reflections from today.
Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm on Equitable Growth's board, but I'm also a former policymaker myself. I was in the Obama administration in the Treasury Department in the White House and the Biden administration in the White House. So one, I just want to express gratitude for everyone who wrote papers, for our speakers today, for such an engaging and lively discussion. Let's give them another round of applause. Our goal today at Equitable Growth was to give you the opportunity to think about how and whether economic trade-offs shouldn't necessarily be the sole focus of economic policymakers like myself, who have sat there and we've looked at the evidence and the data and tried to design really, really good policy, but we weren't always asked to also think about how democracy was implicated. Yes, because we worked for political actors, we thought about how party prospects were going to be implicated, but not necessarily how democracy itself was going to be implicated. And so I think today is a really important discussion to advance that conversation in the economic policy field. The second kind of objective today was, I think a through line you heard through all the papers and the panels was if we take democracy seriously, then we must center people's experiences of the economy as we formulate and implement that economic policy. And really, kind of doing away with the old dichotomy of people versus place-based policy and saying it kind of all matters and we have to work on all those fields at the same time. Equitable Growth, we are here to provide evidence for a stronger economy. That is our tagline. What we really hope to be is a dynamic bridge that helps accelerate feedback loops between academia and policy, but what you saw today was also something a little bit different that we are now doing as well, where we're also bridging and working alongside movement groups. So we very intentionally had Sarah Nelson here from the unions. We very intentionally had Chirag here from Community Change, because we recognize that policy cannot be done on high up here in Washington. You have to be engaging with people who represent the citizens, who are not just elected leaders, or the institutions that organize people, so that we get policy that resonates. And what I wanted to ask folks to do is turn to your neighbor for a second. And I want to, well, first do a raise of hands. Did you learn something interesting today? All right. Did it spark any new ideas for you? Are there people you're going to connect with in the reception hall afterwards? And will you talk about how you're going to change anything? So I hope people spend a little bit of time in our hall there. If Melissa, we have that room still, right? And just talk to each other about what was your aha, what new action you're going to take. And I'll give you my only one aha, because I know we're late on time. And it's, I'm really holding this talk of American exceptionalism and the comparative perspective, and how it helped us understand how broken our democracy is, like structurally broken our democracy is. As I look at other moments of economic populism in the US, they led to actual governance and institutional reforms in our democracy. So I'm really reflecting on what is our generation's charge going to be. You know, in different eras, it was civil service exams. It was direct election of presidents, not going through state legislatures. It was new agencies like the FTC or the CFPB just a decade or so ago. We need to have a real governance and reform agenda that isn't just about the what of policy, it's the how of policy. So that is my aha takeaway, but I hope folks turn to their neighbor and talk about what was your aha and what was your takeaway, because our goal here isn't just to have you learn the evidence and be like, that was interesting. It's faster feedback loops to direct that into new actions by everybody in this room. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sameera. And please join me in thanking the Equitable Growth staff who made today's event possible. Many of them are in the reception space, so be sure to shake their hands and thank them for the event. And also thank you to the staff of the National Union Building, including Dan here. As Alex mentioned, we have cards on the table in front of you all with the QR code, which will take you to the essay series. The first set of essays are up now, and a second set of essays will be released in the early fall. We will also be hosting another event on this topic in the fall in New York with Columbia University. So make sure you're signed up for Equitable Growth emails to get notified about it. We're eager to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. So certainly, I hope that you talk with others in the other room there, and keep the conversation going with us at Equitable Growth. And just want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed today's event.